Thanks a lot. I welcome everyone. It rains here in Turin, but I think the weather is better in your countries. This topic is innovative now, nowadays it is becoming relevant. I work in the area of skills and the transition of young people from school to work. Previously, I worked for the Ministry of Labor in Romania, where I was involved in employment, planning, design and implementation of programs, as well as on-the-job training. Today we will have a short presentation. I will introduce the Youth Guarantee Initiative, and this is a comprehensive initiative that was made to look at the employment needs of young people. You know that in 2008 to 2010 there was a big economic crisis that also affected young people. Members of the European Union decided that it was necessary to make changes to political approaches, looking at the key indicators of youth and employment, and at other indicators, at another group of people, young people who are unemployed, and young people who are not active, the youth who do not go to school. They have a family, they have responsibility for the family, and they are trying to find a job, but cannot find a job in their own country, etc. And the idea was to look at the policy, practices and how they were implemented and test Finland, Austria, the Netherlands and the UK. And based on the general consensus of the European Union, 27 members of the European Union at the time, and the new policy approach of the Youth Guarantee was approved based on the general consensus of the 27 members of the European Union at that time. This is not only about objectives, goals, it is not only about ambitions, it is also about detailed monitoring and evaluation of the implementation of policies and programs. This story began in 2012, more than 10 years ago, and the target group at that time was youth from 15 to 24 years old. In 2020, an analysis of changes in the labor market and in the field of education was carried out, and the members of the European Union decided to reach young people aged from 15 to 29 years. This was done because statistical analysis showed that young people who study more, for example at universities, are also consequences of tertiary education, and they are in a transition period in the labor market, and they are faced with their first experience in the labor market when they turn 24, 25, 26 years old. In this regard, the members of the European Union decided to change the age category from 24 to 29 years. And we looked at various indicators, and the DARYA project also helps to collect statistics. And it is important that there is a profile of young people in each country, who suffers more or who is at risk of not being employed and not being active. In some countries of the European Union, women predominate in this age group. At this age they already have children, they become mothers. They sit at home and lose the opportunity to find employment or get a job. In some countries, where there are many young people who finish school early at the age of 15, 16, 17 years, and practically they have no chance to reintegrate into the labor market, because they do not have sufficient qualifications and skills. And that's why all countries use the following approaches. The first step is to determine the profile of young people who did not get a job, did not receive entry/access to the labor market, and are not sufficiently educated. And in 2018, the initiative was quite successful. It was very ambitious, but very successful. And it inspired other countries. And the first country that adapted the National Action Plan for the employment of young people using the principles of the Youth Guarantee was North Macedonia, a southeastern country in the European Union. And when the recommendations on the Youth Guarantee were published by the European Union, they began to conduct public awareness campaigns. And North Macedonia, with the help of the European Fund, managed and was able to not only adapt the new national strategy, they also used the national budget. Then later, after the COVID pandemic, in countries where large groups of young people who are exposed to the economy were in economic shock. And the idea was to show North Macedonia as a successful destination, and then other countries like Serbia, Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina would also develop plans for a youth guarantee and implement them. The ILO and ETF then launched a technical assistance mechanism to start mapping young people who are not involved in either employment or education. They look at their systems in these countries, how they need to reform the system of training, education, and employment. And together with our colleagues who developed the DARYA project, it was launched in a timely manner, and we considered a number of elements on the Youth Guarantee in order to include elements in general projects. And some elements of the DARYA project are capacity building in statistics, gaining knowledge on youth and women. These are components of the Youth Guarantee approach. And we worked with the Eastern Partnership countries. This is the European Union Youth Programme. We covered Central and Eastern Europe. Last year, Thailand approached us with a request to organize a study trip to Italy, and then they tested these youth guarantee initiatives in several regions of Thailand. Thank you, dear colleagues, for your comments. This again speaks to what we call NEET. This is a reduction in the proportion of young people not engaged in education, work, or vocational training, NEET. Here, to some extent, what is repeated from one side to the other is what you mentioned. The categories and groups are the same as those that are characteristic of other countries where these policies are being implemented in the field of providing employment to young people. And again, we talked about the need. What needs to be done can be different. Some mentioned the level of education. Again, you said that the risk increases that young people who cannot get a complete secondary education can enter this group of NEET. For example, in Albania the situation is completely opposite. There are many people with higher education who graduated from universities but cannot find a job. Therefore, from country to country we can say that there can be such big differences. This also applies to those who have a technical education and those who have a higher education but who equally cannot be employed or are not actively looking for jobs, i.e. there can be very different reasons behind this. Of course, young people with physical disabilities, or who have been convicted, who face great challenges, difficulties, and the next point is appropriate training. Indeed, there is not always a correspondence between the needs in the labor market and the education that young people have received. And in principle, with regard to guarantees for young people, naturally, they may differ depending on the priorities in the country's policy and, again, this is the concept of timely and high-quality proposals. And when we talk about proposals in the context of youth guarantees, these are measures, programs, events aimed at young people who belong to the NEET group. This could be an apprenticeship, internship, probationary period to continue education. Again, as part of the youth guarantee, young people can return to school and complete their education. Why do we say timely? Why does the concept include the term timeliness? Because such support should be provided within 4 months. At first, they talked about 6 months, but then it was decided to reduce it to 4 months, starting from the moment they completed their education and were not active or working. Again, studies have shown that young people who don't get support quickly enough after they graduate don't get the support they need, the information they need to find a job, they lose faith and drop out of the labor market. And then it is difficult and costly to help them later on after 6 months or even a year. And we have to remember, if we talk about the level of employment, unemployment in relation to who we are looking at, those who are out of work for more than 12 months or more than a year, this refers to long-term youth employment. The calculations already take into account 6 months, so young people who are unemployed for more than 6 months are considered unemployed for a long period of time, and as I said, it becomes very difficult to support them and also to talk about the success or good impact of being able to get a job. And so quite often it relates to training, qualification frameworks and similar issues. We will discuss this later. And what should be done to develop and implement guarantees for young people is, of course, the issue of close cooperation between those who are engaged in education, labor market, good statistical information, in general, good information system of state structures, which concerns both the labor market and information of the educational system. So that all young people, students at the age of 14, 15 years old, when they want to leave school and they show low grades, there should be teachers as well as social workers who should consider the situation of what is happening with these young people. We can take preventive measures so that these young people do not leave school and try to keep them in school. That is why we are talking about an early warning mechanism. Another element is to track graduates to understand the paths they take after graduation, how many continue their studies at the university level, how many of them were able to find a job that meets their expectations and education, and who ends up unemployed and why, and who stays inactive and for what reasons. And it's not just a matter of their numbers, but specifically who it is in terms of gender. It's more men or women, maybe more those who are from rural areas, as one of the comments said about that. And so it's important to have that comprehensive data and information system. Well, I think we can move on to the next slide now. Eve, please. But I'm really not going to go into detail here, there's quite a lot of information. But you got the Russian version of the recommendations, it's just on youth guarantee. It's kind of summarizing the policy recommendations. Just like the structure of this youth guarantee. As I said before, it starts with mapping and identifying the need that each country has to develop a youth guarantee and maybe even test it. And so you have to follow the steps. First of all, mapping the profile of these people, what are their risks and similar issues. Similarly, on the ETF side, we say that in this work we need to look at the quality, because these are also elements that hinder young people who are actively looking for work. To look at migration flows, contextual elements that need to be taken into account, i.e., you don't have to look only at the needs profile. This is useful, but it doesn't give a complete picture of why they belong to this NEET group and what are the chances of making them more active. The second phase or stage is the external work, which my colleague Gloria will talk about on Wednesday if I am not mistaken in more detail. And the external work, it is critical to identify and register the target group, to provide them with counseling and referrals for mentoring and to help them provide opportunities. Then there's the next stage, is the preparation stage. And then they develop individual plans, actions for the youth in each country, so they look at individual cases and they set up a set of activities. For example, young people, they have some work experience, but usually in this informal context, and then there comes a point when you need to validate this learning process that took place in an informal context, and then they will be able to get a job. And this is an example of the measures that are done at the preparation stage. And the last one is the proposal itself. If you remember the previous slide, we talked about employment opportunities or subsidized employment opportunities. So we are talking about those programs that are being implemented. And I think that your countries also have these kinds of employment measures like self-employment, entrepreneurship, or providing certain credits, loans. Just like opportunities for training or to go back to school for those of them who have not completed the compulsory secondary level of education. This is more or less the structure of the youth guarantee, and you can already conclude that it is not easy. So it requires a broad partnership between the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Labor, various state agencies that deal with employment, social partnership, trade union and employers organizations, youth organization and other nonprofit organizations, in particular those that support people with disabilities. And all these stakeholders should work together, and they should have a common plan for the implementation of youth guarantee so that there is a clear distribution of responsibilities based on their resources. And then it is very important to understand how to create an enabling environment. I don't know how those that create such a favorable context and those that create conditions for the implementation of different initiatives fit in. The data collection and monitoring is also a very important point. As for the monitoring, it should not only look at the number that are considered official, but also indicators that are defined by a time frame, for example, whether a person has received support within 4 months or not. Again, this is the indicator that relates to the monitoring of the youth guarantee because we can't talk about monitoring now. We will focus on it a little later when we will discuss with the participation of representatives of statistical agencies and with various departments of the Ministry of Labor and Employment agencies to consider these indicators of the transition from school to work with young people who are not working and are not active, consideration of these timeframes, because we said that it changes the way the collection of these data and the calculation of indicators. It's quite a complicated process. Do you have any questions or clarifications regarding this part of the presentation? If you have questions or clarifications, you can ask me. If there are no questions, we will move on to consider providers of employment services. These are mainly government agencies and to active policies in the labor market. This slide summarizes the main points of the transition from school to work. We primarily provide career guidance and counseling, quality education and training, and on-the-job training, which is what we call apprenticeships. But there is also a big impact. This is legislation that relates to the field of politics and taxation, i.e. certain provisions of the European Union which allow and permit short-term work when young people are hired. This of course affects the quality of jobs in the same way as issues of informal working conditions. But again, if we talk about the success of the transition from school to work, we can say from school to employment that this refers to labor market policy, and if we apply the terminology of the European Union in statistics, we define labor market policy as issues of consultation and orientation that are offered by various government structures, just like various measures of training, retraining, recognition, support for entrepreneurship, subsidies, various incentives, government programs. Called active labor measures or programs, the terminology may differ at the global level. We're now moving to the last slide. We are looking at the possibility of reviewing the powers and capabilities of public employment services, and these are often part of the Ministry of Labor. They have regional district offices. But in this presentation, we are looking at individual employment services. From my experience, for 10 years we have been monitoring how youth guarantees are implemented. And on the slide, the blue columns summarize the impact of legislation and institutional structure to guarantee youth to implement this program at the level of public employment services. This all applies to the countries of the European Union and also to the countries of the Western Balkans. And first of all, it is necessary to reconsider the powers of public employment services, not only from a legal point of view, but including resource potential. For example, to develop potential and competencies so that they work with those who are looking for work and the unemployed, as well as to map those people who have lost hope. And for those who work with vulnerable groups, it is also very important that the consultants who work in the employment service are competent. This actually expands the client base of employment services. The second is labor market program policies to make them more active so that they meet the requirements of young people. We know a new generation of young people who are entering the labor market and new ways are needed. We are now looking at new forms, people's aspirations, and therefore interventions must meet the aspirations of young people. Then it is necessary to diversify employment support programs in order to meet the individual requirements of young people. But you also need to meet the demands of the labor market, of employers. And usually how it all works is to design skills programs more effectively, not only to implement 12-month or 18-month qualification programs, but using digital tools, and so that there is an effective implementation of these programs, and so their duration will be shortened. This is what young people and employers expect. We don't need young people to be in training for 18 months. There is a need for blended programs, online and on-site, modular. The slide shows examples of how to make programs more flexible to meet the aspirations of the labor market. And also work at the level of municipalities, with city hall offices, with companies, trade unions, NGOs. And we see successful examples, for example in Serbia and North Macedonia, to create working groups, local committees to implement employment programs, including activation of young people, so that local stakeholders meet on a regular basis and decide how to respond to the needs of young people. These are the key messages to make the labor market policy more effective. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. I will go very quickly because these elements will be presented in more detail by my colleague Stefan, who will be talking about workplace learning, and that will be in June. And I hope you will take the time to participate in this session. In June, this topic will be addressed in more detail. This is just the most difficult part of the guarantee for young people, from my experience, because not always the active market program and whether those programs that target those who we classify as NEETs, they define a quality framework for apprenticeships and training. Earlier we looked at the big components that are part of the guarantee. We talked about elements like apprenticeships, internships. And if you take the Western Balkans, we have created a dictionary of key terminology for the whole Balkan region. I will share that with Eva. We know that some aspects have been lost in the translation. In some countries there are no already accepted words for apprenticeships. And as for the guarantee of young people, in the programs we consider a quality framework for apprenticeships. The difference between apprenticeships and internships is the length of time, i.e. it is important for such an opportunity for young people to be in the campaign and learn something, gain experience. It is a question of time, not 1 week, 2 weeks, a month, it should be longer, and the shortest time is 6 months. And this is about apprenticeship. The difference between apprenticeships and internships is the length of time, i.e. it is important for such an opportunity for young people to be in the campaign and learn something, gain experience. It is a question of time, not 1 week, 2 weeks, a month, it should be longer, and the shortest time is 6 months. And this is about apprenticeship. And I would like to address one element that my colleague will talk about in more detail in June. This is about the difference between apprenticeship and internship, because we are talking about what outcomes are obtained. What is shown in blue are the learning outcomes of both programs, or both opportunities should lead to specific outcomes. For example, when it comes to apprenticeship, it is the acquisition of new qualifications or some components that relate to a new qualification. And then when it comes to internship, we are talking about specific competencies, not necessarily new qualifications. We should realize that there is such a difference, and we should not consider internship as a component of youth guarantee. And this mistake was made in many countries including Italy, when in the beginning of 2013 to 2014 they had a plan to implement the Youth Guarantee. There was a lot of practical work for young people, but of very low quality without proper certification of the knowledge gained at the end of the program. Then there was a lot of work when young people had to work without pay, and these were mistakes that should be avoided. Again, when we talk about apprenticeships and internship, it is very important to look at what is in your national legislation. It was mentioned earlier about internships within some companies, and Jamshed also mentioned today that it is important to establish partnerships with companies so that practical training can be conducted on their premises. These are policy elements that are part of both training and internships. And it is neat to look at what is in the national legislation, then move to the national qualification framework. Next slide, please. This slide is about the National Qualifications Framework and why it is so important. And the key component of the Youth Guarantee is that we can't judge the quality of Youth Guarantee offerings without the possibility to have qualification standards and the possibility to validate learning outcomes. This also applies to apprenticeships and internships or other applications of systems that exist at the national level that relate to the validation of learning outcomes. And quality assurance procedures are required, the various stages of its functioning, and please remember that this applies not only to initial training, internships, but also to adult training, again taking into account different contexts. National qualifications frameworks can ensure transparency, equality, which signifies the acquisition of relevant knowledge. The problem, for example, in the Western Balkans, with regard to youth guarantees, although they had a national qualifications framework, was that they did not have enough resources to develop qualification standards. For example, they could have programs in Kosovo where there were 300 or fewer standards for those jobs or professions that were not attractive to young people, and therefore efforts were needed to develop new qualification standards, and that this would apply to vacancies in emerging new sectors, for example ICT, green economy, and so on. And again, we are talking about professional standards, but it is also important that training offers are attractive. I would like to connect this with the fact that certain weaknesses in the political sphere affect the overall implementation of the Youth Guarantee. I would like to stop here for questions and comments. And let's look at another slide, because it is necessary to have such a validation system on site in order to help public employment services, so that they use them, so that they are part of the process. Well, I'm watching a presentation on the screen that doesn't show the slide I asked to open. I hope it will be shown later. But if you take the example of my country Romania and the Western Balkans, they just included the validation of non-formal learning in the sphere of policies and programs of the labor market. That is to say, the training time has been reduced, but the efficiency of training has increased. But noting this, I would like to stop, but the last slide we could quickly go through it, how to build effective approaches to Youth Guarantee. This refers to a monitoring framework, to look at new data sources or reform existing sources, various surveys, questionnaires to identify those young people we categorize as NEETs, to look at existing inconsistencies in regulations and data consolidation and monitoring policies, active labor market policies and registration of job seekers. It is also about capacity, institutional partnerships and consolidation of efforts to identify who is active, who can do their part to make this a truly effective transition from school to the labor market. This is a long-term initiative of the European Union countries. It started in 2013 and is still in the process of revision. Youth guarantees are costly activities, but on the other hand it is not necessarily all implemented at once. There are pilot moments. Again, you have to take into account the context of a particular country and the relevance, the effectiveness of the programs that will respond to this or that context. That's about the last slide. Thank you.